All right, so we're going to prepare the mold now, and I have half of the flask. The two parts of the flask are the cope and the drag, and what I've done is I've laid down the half patterns for these two parts, and I'm going to locate those inside the frame, and take a little parting dust and coat everything so that the sand won't stick to it. And the big thing is that the sand won't really stick to the patterns, but it will stick to itself, and I want to be able to pull the two parts of the sand apart. Alright, so I'm going to take a riddle. The first few layers of sand need to be passed through a riddle to make sure that we get all the lumps and bumps out. Now today we are using Petrobond sand. The other option would be green sand, which is obviously both are sands. Green sand is typically a mixture of fine silica sand, some bentonite clay to use as a binder, and some water. And Petrobond is the same sand and clay mixture, but it uses an oil as a binder. And because the oil is a little bit more effective binder than the water, it's easier to bind together really fine sand. So Petrobond has a reputation for giving a better finish and being more faithful in following your pattern. Fact of the matter is, somebody who knows what they're doing can get pretty darn good results out of green sand as well if they've mixed it up themselves. Alright, we're just going to put a little more loose sand in the flask here. And you can see that the sand that I've sifted in is nice and fluffy, so I can push it into the corners where I need it, and then I'm going to firm it up, being careful not to move the patterns. And in the pulley, as you can see, we have a recess, so it's important to get the sand all the way down in all the recesses. Alright, so now we can start just piling sand in. We don't have to sift this part through the riddle.
And a riddle is just a screen?
Yes, and riddles come in different grades based on the space between the wires. Okay. Alright, so we put some more sand in. Sort of located it where I want it. Now it's time to start tamping. And we go around the perimeter first, because there's nothing more frustrating than ramming up a mold only to have the sand fall out when you first pick it up. So it's always important to get the perimeter first. And you can ram this pretty firmly. And now it's time to just go ahead and compact the rest of the sand. And it always takes more sand than you think. And take a different flat-bottomed rammer. And a strike-off tool, which is really nothing more than a piece of angle iron. Could be a piece of wood, doesn't matter. Just as long as it's a reasonable straight edge. Alright. So now we're going to take mold up on its side, and you can see the pieces in there. All right, I'm going to take the second half of the flask. Okay, now we're going to take the second half of the patterns, and using the locating pins, we're going to add them and there we go, and a bit more parting dust. All right, and we get to riddle some more sand in here. All right, so we're just going to pat the sand back down, and it looks like we're going to need a little more over on this side. Now, riddles come in a variety of different screens. The two that are used most commonly in foundry work are number 40 and a number 80. And the 40 and the 80 refer to the distance between the wires. All right. Now we are actually filling, as I said, the flask is made up of two parts, the cope and the drag. So the cope is the top, the drag is the bottom. And the cope is the side that gets the sprue, which is the channel for the molten metal to come in. So we can put the sprue in now. There are actually a couple different methods of doing this. You can put the sprue in now, you put the sprue in later. Everybody has a different idea of when, but often the pattern itself, or the mold that you're making, will dictate when you do certain steps. But this is a pretty simple mold here. We're going to go ahead and put the sprue in now. And we're going to have to open another bucket here. And again, we're going to go around the perimeter and make sure we've got firm sand holding the pattern together, or the mold together, excuse me. Now you may notice that this sand is a little bit darker, and that's because it's been used a few more times in that first bucket. And as the sand gets used, the part that's closest to the metal actually burns a bit. The oil that's used as a binder burns off, which is where you see the smoking, or which you will see later on when we pour the mold. And with Petrobond you normally try and pick out the really charred sand when you first break down the mold and set it aside for processing later on. But you can use the sand several times before you have to mull it again, which is the process of loosening it all up and filling it full of fresh oil, the binder. And you don't really need to worry about getting sand down the sprue at this moment, because we're going to have the mold all apart again before we're done. Give us a chance to get it cleaned out. All right, we're going to strike off again, which basically just means getting the excess sand off of our mold. All right, I'm going to go ahead and pull the sprue now. Okay, so with the sprue out, I'm going to carve what we call the pouring basin. And I'm just using a tool that's called a slick or a spoon. But what I'm doing is I'm giving myself a target, something to shoot for when I go to pour. The important thing here is that I don't want to leave loose sand on the surface to get washed down into the mold when I do pour. So I'm going to take a little bit of time and just make sure everything is firm.
Okay.
All right, so we're going to take the mold apart right now so that we can do some more work on the inside, where we're going to cut runners and gates and all sorts of fun things. And remember, I said not to worry about getting sand down the sprue, and that's why we're going to open the mold again, so I can get that out of the way. Alrighty. Now this may look remarkably like your wife's best makeup brush, but I promise you that's not where this came from. Alright, now I'm going to carve out another little basin down here in the drag. And this gives us a place for the molten metal to come down. And the idea of this particular little basin is that any loose sand that might get pulled down with the molten metal will end up down here and will stay in the bottom instead of filling into the, or being pulled into one of our parts. Alright, so now we need to get the molten metal that's come down the sprue into our basin here and get it over to each of the parts. And so we're going to start cutting a runner. We've got a runner to the smaller part. Now a runner to the other part. And we're just going to spend a little time cleaning everything up. Now, what we want to avoid here is any sharp edges, because the molten metal does not pour well around sharp edges. And you can end up with what are referred to as cold shuts, which is where the metal flows in one direction and then tries to backfill, but can't because the first metal to enter the mold is already frozen. And surprisingly enough, we can actually use compressed air to blow out the loose sand, although you'll notice that I have this regulated down to about 3 psi, so it's not disturbing the sand, it's just loosening or blowing away the loose sand. Alrighty. Okay, I think we're probably ready to start taking some parts out of here. So what I'm going to do is just put some drywall screws directly into the wooden pattern. Alright, just tighten the screws into the wooden pattern. And then that one's loose. Alright, so let's pull that pattern out. And pull that one out. Alright, and I'm just going to very lightly brush the sharp edges at the edge of the patterns. The reason for that is I don't want any sand to fall into the part, and if I brush a little bit of the edge away, it's not a problem. It just means I get a tiny bit of flash that I need to clean up when the part is molded. But these parts are going to be machined anyway after molding, so that's not a problem. Now, one important thing is, if you notice right down here, we have a nice sharp edge, and we don't want sharp edges because the metal is not going to flow nicely around a sharp edge. So I'm going to very gently break those edges and round them off a little bit. And then we spend some time packing down all the loose sand again. Alrighty. Alright, we're going to set that side apart for just a moment. And now we're going to work on the cope. And we're going to do the same thing using some screws. Get these two pieces out. And again, we're going to take care of any little sharp edges that can collapse, get in our way, put sand in our mold. Okay, the last thing we need to do is, there it is. We need to put some risers in here. The risers do a couple different things. Number one, they give a path for the smoke and the steam and all the mess to get out of the mold. But more importantly, they form a little column of extra metal that can be pulled back down into the mold as the metal is cooling. All metal shrinks, expands when it's hot, it shrinks back down as it's cooling, and of course as it does, it needs to pull metal from somewhere, and so we build risers here. And these are simply little columns that will fill with molten metal as we're pouring the mold, and will provide a ready source of additional metal when the part's needed. Okay, now just a little bit of repair down here. And again, we don't have to be real accurate here because this is a part of the hub of each of these pulleys that's going to be machined. So if it's just a little rough, it's not an issue. All right. We're bringing the cope back up, or the drag, excuse me, and we're going to rejoin the mold. So we'll put the cope on the top and the drag on the bottom. Okay, and the last thing we need to do is have some means of making absolutely certain that the mold stays firmly together, and we're just going to use a couple of C-clamps. But what can happen when you fill the mold is you get a lot of hydraulic pressure inside the mold, and it can actually lift the top half away from the drag, and then you've got a real mess. All right, so the mold is now done. So we're going to take it over and place it on the ground where we're going to fill it and heat up some metal. First thing we're going to do, I've already loaded a bunch of little bits and pieces of scrap aluminum into my furnace. Now I'm going to add just a little bit of flux to the mix here. The flux will melt under the heat and will form a barrier on top of the molten metal to keep the oxygen away from the molten metal. So close the lid. I've got a few extra bits and pieces ready to go in to fill the crucible as the other parts melt. So now we're ready to light the furnace. I've already connected the furnace to both electricity and propane. So what I'm going to do is turn the gas to the start position. Push the button to start, and then I'm going to hold the yellow or the black button down until the furnace actually stays lit. And I'm looking for this red light to go out. It's controlled by a thermocouple that has to reach temperature. There it goes. And so now I can take my finger off, and the furnace will continue to run. I'm going to let it idle here for just a couple minutes until the temperature comes up. Then I'll go ahead and put the gas to the open position and turn the air up to get some heat going. Alright, so the furnace is warmed up a bit now. I'm going to go ahead and give it some more gas and turn the heat up. Turn the air up, excuse me. Sounds a bit more like a jet engine. comes out as powder. Okay. Good. It's been about 15 minutes or so we can start pulling some of the sand out of this mold and see how we did. Now, normally, I would just pull all the sand out and drop it in a bucket, but right now I don't have a muller, which is a mixer for mixing the sand. So what I have to do is take the unburned sand and put it back in this bucket for reuse. And in a moment we'll get down to the sand that's right around the metal, and you'll be able to see that it's just burned black. And I'm going to put that in this bucket so that we can deal with it at a later date. So at any rate, I'm just going to go ahead and keep digging away at this for a few minutes, and we'll be back with you. All right, I've dug away about as much sand as I can for the moment. Let's go ahead and take a quick peek and see what we got here. And it looks like we've got a good pour. Yep. But you can see all the black sand around there. That's just burned. That's the oil that's in the sand, the binder that's burned. So the sand can be reconstituted, but we need to get a proper mixer to do that. All right, I think we're going to leave it right there and let it cool for a little while, and then we'll come back and take another look. And so we got a little bit of shrinkage over here, but not too bad. Alrighty. Alright, so what I'm doing now is just taking all the burned dry sand off so we can see exactly what we've got. I'd say we got a pretty good casting. Now we do have a bit of shrinkage right along here. And if I had to guess, I'm going to say that I didn't make the riser large enough. So there wasn't, this metal here froze or hardened before this could pull down everything it needed. But since we left a pretty generous machining margin on this part, that's not going to be a problem. Machining margin is that amount of material that you're planning on cutting away. And there we go. Now, it's still just a little bit too hot to hold, so I'm going to go ahead and put it in the bucket and cool it down so that we can cut the runners off and you can see what these parts actually look like. And we'll just leave it for a minute and let it cool down some. And there's the larger of the two. Here's the part we just cast, and here's what it'll look like after we've finished machining it. And same thing with the 3-inch pulley. Just looks like a big lump of aluminum, but when we're all done, we'll have a nice pulley. And these parts that we cut off can be thrown back in the melt and melted down and used again. So that's a nice thing about casting aluminum. There's no wastage. We've got a beautiful, nice, tight grain pattern. So casting went very well.